Welcome back, everyone, to Issues of Faith. Our guest joining us via Zoom is Joerg Rieger. He is a professor of theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School. He's written a bunch of books, and his work addresses the relation of theology and public life, reflecting on the misuse of power in religion, politics, and economics. We're talking about Christian nationalism, also statolatry, which we defined earlier. And so my question is, there are well-meaning people, but there are some concerns. You clearly have some concerns. Where do we go from here? How do we protect Christianity? You know, where do we go from here, in your opinion? And that's the question.
Yes, what we had talked about earlier, when it comes to nationalism, there's nothing wrong with having an appreciation for your nation, but it has to go hand in hand with some questions. So the assumption that the nation, the way it is always perfect, I think we have to let go of that. And so once we open that up, you know, we've already talked about freedom. But there's two things here. And if you think about the Pledge of Allegiance, of course, we're talking about liberty, freedom, and justice for all. So it's this notion of justice, I think, that we have to put together with this notion of freedom, and not to confuse the two, and not to assume that when we say freedom, all we mean is sort of the freedom of large corporations. We're talking about the freedom of the people. At Vanderbilt Divinity School, let me just mention that to your listeners, I'm directing the Wendland Cook program in religion and justice. And our question of justice here, we're focusing especially on questions of economic and ecological justice, is precisely this. What does justice mean in a Christian context? So I'm doing this work as a theologian. I don't want to give any generic definitions of justice, but I want to know what would it mean, you know, in the Jesus movement to actually put liberty and justice together. And I think this is a fascinating conversation that would really do us some good and would reframe the whole question of Christian nationalism, would move us away from statolatry, to be sure, as well.
Theologically speaking, you know, what would you say as far as where Jesus would come down? Jesus was always a bit of a rebel, and I think
exactly.
in some of these instances where you have Christian nationalism, it's you know, America can do no wrong, and this is absolute, and what would you, again, somebody's coming down along those lines, you say what to them about Jesus?
So Jesus was a rebel. I think that is a really important statement here that Christians oftentimes forget. And when we say rebel, you know, we might think of January 6th, but that's not the rebellion of Jesus. The rebellion of Jesus, the way I see it, if you read the Gospels, was to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the oppressed, and you know, to preach the kingdom of God. That the good news is actually real here and now. Now, that really means it's a freedom that is not freedom at the expense of others. As Martin Luther King said, we cannot be free unless we're all free. You know, freedom is something that really has to apply to all. And the rebellious part of the Jesus movement, I would say, is questions like, what about the poor? Are they able not only to get food and shelter, but are they able also to live a happy life? What about people that might not look like us? Are they able to live a free and happy life? And that's not just about our own fellow countrymen. This is really around the world. In that sense, Christianity can never be pressed into any nationalism because Christianity is bigger than that. And at some aspect here, Christianity is what holds us accountable as nations. That's the story of Matthew 25, of course, you know, the story of the Great Judgment, where, you know, the judge says, what you have done to the least of these, you have done to me. And if you read the text, it says, this is the judgment of the nations.
And so, do you know of other situations where, are there other warning signs, either in the Bible or in other parts of the world, that, you know, that you would point to when we are discussing this issue?
The biggest problem, and I think I've indicated that carefully in our earlier conversation, is that people become self-centered, that nations become self-centered, that they look out for themselves first before they look out for others. And that oftentimes has led to great harm. We're certainly seeing this behind many of the wars, and even some of our own wars, right? We're seeing this behind relationships of exploitation. We're seeing this in personal relationships, marital relationships, people exploiting each other, people abusing each other. Most of sexual abuse in the United States is actually happening within families. So this is where I'm most worried about, that we're basically covering over the reality that we have created, which is not always a good one. And thereby we're losing the ability to create and to improve a better reality. That's what I'm looking for. And I think this is what you can see, certainly in the Jesus traditions, but you see this in the prophetic traditions in the Hebrew Bible as well. There are moments when the people of Israel are yearning for a king. Then comes the prophet Samuel and says, well, if you have a king, the king will ultimately exploit you and oppress you also. Not a good idea. Well, they got the king anyway. There were some political struggles that came out of that. You put this together with all kinds of other relationships, all the way to the exile from Egypt and so on, and the Babylonian exile, and then the exodus from Egypt, and you see there's constant movement.
It's
constant
fascinating
efforts to move back to our origins. And
so I'm being told we have to
power.
break. Professor, I'm so sorry, but Joerg Rieger, thank you. We could talk much longer about this. Thank you for being here, and thanks to everyone for watching Issues of Faith.